Hello, Blogging Heads viewers, and welcome to another installment of Foreign Entanglements. I am Robert Farley of the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky, and with me today is Mark Leon Goldberg, the managing editor of UN Dispatch. And it has been at least a little while since the last time he's done a Blogging Heads, and so we're delighted to have.
It's been a little while.
It's been a little while.
I used to do one of these, I did about one a week for almost 3 years, but it's been a little while since I've been back on, so thanks for having me, Robert.
Oh, we're happy to have you. I mean, we both, Matt and myself, have been on quite a bit more than we had previously because of the advent of Foreign Entanglements, which is very exciting for everyone. In fact, for our viewers and listeners, let me recommend our Facebook group called Foreign Entanglements, which you can like, and which will give you important updates and other information regarding foreign entanglements.
I will like that immediately following this.
Right. I mean, don't like it quite.
I didn't even know there's a Facebook group. Look at that.
Right.
How far we've come these past few years.
Oh, it really. I mean, the degree to which we can take over your life has just sort of improved substantially. Right. I mean, who knows what sort of information you're actually giving us by liking that? It might be, your credit card or something. Probably not. Possibly. Zuckerberg probably has your credit card number, but anyway. So today we're going to talk about something that a lot of our recent discussions have revolved around, but there's a reason. It's a big crisis. It's an ongoing crisis. It's been ongoing for quite some time now, which is the continuing situation in Syria, and we are going to talk about some of the permutations of that in terms of sort of more multilateral aspects in the United Nations especially, but also some aspects of international law and how they are affected by and how they affect the development of the situation in Syria. And we may touch on a couple other related subjects as well. So I guess to start off with, what's your handle on what's going on right now in Syria, and what are your thoughts on
it? So we are recording this on Tuesday at about 2:30 in the afternoon. The siege of Homs has been ongoing for 11 days straight now. So basically, ever since the Security Council, the Saturday before last, proved itself unable to pass a resolution on Syria. Sort of the city of Homs has been under sort of a constant artillery fire and attack. So that's what seems to be happening on the ground. Obviously, there's there's not much foreign. There's really no foreign press on the ground there. So what we glean from mostly activist groups and YouTube videos and some NGOs that happen to be on the ground. Diplomatically, the next move seems to be this sort of Friends of Syria group that's coalescing. My understanding is they're going to hold their first meeting somewhere in the Arab world this weekend. I think Cairo. But the Arab League is convening this, and presumably it will include the United States and Western Europe and pretty much everyone else other than Russia and China.
Right.
And Iran, presumably.
Right.
Yeah. So that seems to be the latest news-wise as what's happening. And meanwhile, I guess the other sort of latest bit of news to trickle out of Geneva, where the UN Human Rights Office is that the top UN human rights official, a South African jurist named Navi Pillay, sort of unleashed at the Security Council. She got really mad. She said, "You guys need to get your act together. What are you doing? You are encouraging the slaughter that's ongoing on the ground." And she's an interesting and dynamic UN official. She's not the first woman to hold her job, but she is the first African woman to hold her job. And it's sort of interesting to see her bring her perspective to this.
Now, so we can step back just a second, and I also want to talk a little bit about the outrage aspect, because Ambassador Rice, of course, last week also had sort of unusually frank words with regards to Russia and China. But when we talk about the siege of Homs, exactly what do we mean? I mean, to what degree are sort of, whether it's Free Syrian Army, whatever that may be, to what extent are sort of armed protesters holding the city and preventing the Syrian military from entering? I mean, is that really the situation that's characterizing the city right now when we say under siege, that there is somebody holding the city that isn't the Syrian military? And so that's why we're seeing artillery and armored personnel carriers and so forth. And I saw the pictures of the anti-aircraft guns being used, or at least theoretically being used, and so forth. So, I mean, obviously the situation is quite serious, and major forces being brought to bear on sort of anti-Assad forces in Homs and elsewhere.
So my understanding, and it's, I'll admit perhaps it's an imperfect understanding, is that there are a few, maybe 3 or 4 neighborhoods in Homs that are effectively under siege. So it's not it's partly the whole city, but it's these 3 or 4 neighborhoods that are being actively targeted. And really interestingly, the former I don't know if he's the former ambassador, but the current ambassador who had left Syria, Ambassador Ford, posted a satellite image to his Facebook page earlier this week, sort of showing how these neighborhoods were under attack by artillery. So it seems to be the case that there's maybe softening these targets. It seems as if it's sort of indiscriminate fire into these neighborhoods. So, again, it's an imperfect understanding of what's happening on the ground by virtue of the fact that there's not many foreign eyes and ears on the ground.
Right.
And really there's one great English language or English speaking video blogger who went by the name of Danny, who was providing these chilling YouTube clips in sort of perfect sort of British English, British accented English, from these neighborhoods, showing what was happening. But my understanding is that he's actually just escaped to Lebanon. So our sort of best, or the internet's best, voice and advocate for an eye for what was happening on the ground seems to have just left.
So we'll try to do we don't post many links to the Blogging Head site itself anymore, but we'll post these links on the Facebook group, which is another reason to like the Facebook.
Yeah, and they're definitely worth checking out. I mean, it's gripping. It was basically the only English video that was coming out of there for a long time.
Right. So the resistance in these neighborhoods is small arms. I mean, is that primarily what we have here?
I don't know.
Really?
To be honest, I don't know. I mean, I'm not that close to the ground. Basically, what I know is from what I've been reading in press reports and seeing on these YouTube clips.
Right.
I guess I can't speak to that level of detail of what's actually happened there. I mean, I've been, most of my sort of approach or my coverage of the Syria crisis and the siege of Homs and all that has been sort of through the UN perspective.
Right.
How has the Security Council approached the situation? How various sort of UN humanitarian agencies approach the situation.
Right. All right, so I mean, moving in that direction, so we obviously know that, and this was the major news from last week or week and a half ago, that the major, the weaker resolution then had been the case in Libya, but still the resolution to condemn the Assad regime failed because of a Russian and Chinese veto. So, I mean, what's the next step then from your perspective from the UN, right? I mean, what other tools does the United Nations have, or what other sort of multilateral tools does the United Nations have access to that either sort of directly affect the situation or that improve our understanding of what's going on in these areas, or give some other avenue for affecting Syrian behavior or for affecting the behavior of the anti-regime elements in Syria right now?
Mm-hmm. So it looks like the Security Council is basically a non-starter right now. I mean, that could change. Russia can moderate its position, and my guess is that most of the diplomatic effort going forward is going to be geared at sort of convincing Russia to go along with some sort of something at the Security Council. It could be something less than a resolution, which is a presidential statement, which is not sort of a legally binding document like a resolution is, but is still politically relevant for the fact that it requires the approval of all 15 members to pass. So my guess is that we will see, especially coming out of this Friends of Syria group, just a redoubled effort diplomatically on Russia. Outside of the Security Council, there's the Human Rights Council. And that's a place where no country has a veto. Russia is on the Human Rights Council right now, I believe. It's a 42-member council, and we could see a resolution passing. Mm-hmm. And what that resolution would probably entail is the formation of a commission of inquiry, mm-hmm. Which I guess doesn't sound all that terrible. But it's basically the first step of a process, mm-hmm. the last step of which is bringing this issue. The last step of which is a Security Council referral to the International Criminal Court. Mm-hmm. Again, that's a long way off right now for political reasons, but at least at the Human Rights Council, they can start to get the ball rolling by appointing this commission of inquiry. Right. Now, the problem is this commission of inquiry would not have access to Syria. I mean, one of the big problems is that Syria is not letting foreigners into their country right now, right. Or anyone with a UN flag into their country. So the actual ability for the UN to affect Assad's decision making right now is pretty limited.
So, if the ability to affect Assad's decision making is limited, then I'm very curious about the procedure by which we're trying to affect Russia's decision making, because Russia's decision making seems to me to have been fairly adamant so far in terms of support from mm-hmm. Assad, right? I mean, for one thing, you had the major visit from Lavrov recently, but you've also it was Lavrov, right? It wasn't just his ambassador, right? It was the foreign minister. Or am I wrong about that?
I don't know. I believe Lavrov, right. the foreign minister, did go right. to Syria last week and was greeted with flowers and all that.
Flowers and thank you for the vote and everything else.
Yeah, flowers.
Well, before that, you had essentially the Russian carrier battle group that visited the mm-hmm. Russian naval base in Tartarus, which is also a fairly big deal.
I'd actually be interested in hearing from you more about that, because that's something I think is it's a hugely important part of the story is Russia arming Syria right now, right. and sending and sort of sending shipments right to Syria's port. And I was wondering if you can untangle that.
I mean, it's been very interesting from my perspective, because I'm certainly interested in the Russian arms industry, and I'm sort of more broadly interested in Russia's enduring military profile, but both the visit to the port, to this Russian naval base, and the Russian naval base essentially is valuable to the Russians because it provides a presence in the Mediterranean, but also because it provides a waypoint between the Russian Navy and the Black Sea and the Russian Navy and the rest of the world, right? I mean, Russia, historically, and even today, has one of the most constrained naval maritime geography of any state, right? Because they have very widely separated ports that don't have much access to each other, and so you need a port like you have in Syria in order to provide. I mean, it's literally possible for Russian ships to transit the Mediterranean without stopping in Syria, but it's still nice to have a port like that. And you also, you've had certainly some shipments of a variety of weapons to Syria, but you also had a pretty major deal for some training and light attack aircraft that don't actually, and I forget, Yak something or other, that don't actually. Wouldn't actually be useful or delivered in time for this particular conflict, presumably, if it doesn't go for another few years. But that still signal what would appear to be a great deal of confidence on the part of the Putin regime that Assad is going to be there to accept delivery of these things and then to pay for them. Which was very interesting. I mean, it was a sort of a very clear vote of confidence as well, along with the Lavrov visit and the aircraft carrier visit. It was a military vote of confidence in a sort of declaring a very firm belief that this regime is going to be there for a while and should be there for a while, and we're even willing to take risks to ensure that it is there for a while.
I guess it's surprising to me that they didn't hedge a little bit, right? And say, this regime may fall soon, and we want to keep Syria as our clients. It doesn't matter who the head of government is. Right. We want to keep our military base there.
Right.
So that's actually somewhat surprising to me. That's actually been one of the bigger shocks I've had of this whole sort of
No, it's a major risk because it's hard to figure out what other Mediterranean clients state that the Russians can really work out for their Mediterranean transit needs. One interpretation is that the Russian, especially their arms industry, looks out at the world and sees a dwindling number of potential customers because they're losing contracts with China. They have the potential to lose contracts with India in the future because the Indian military is simply moving beyond what the Russian industry can provide. And so the Russian military industry is really desperate to maintain what customers it has. So that's one interpretation. But it also seems a pretty broad level of commitment to just sort of be generated by the Russian military-industrial complex at this point. And it seems like Putin, for domestic reasons, I think I've seen this suggested in a few other places, for domestic reasons, wants to be seen as being able to push back against the West and play this very strong Russia as a superpower card. Also sort of wants to push back against the idea that there are these things like the Arab Spring that could emerge in Egypt and Syria and then potentially could emerge in Russia with all these demonstrators. And so you have a lot of Russian reasons for pushing back, but they're really all in, right? You could see very easily how this turns into a profound disaster for Russian foreign policy, where you not only lose the client, but you alienate the future state by the degree to which they've gone all in support of, in direct support not of Syria but of the Assad regime. Right, their friend is Assad, and if he goes, then all bets are off.
Yeah. What'll happen?
Right. Is your sense that China's position on this is sort of essentially contingent on Russian support? That the Chinese don't. I mean, it's typical Chinese behavior at the UN. Correct me if I'm wrong. That on issues, mainly out of their region, and they do tend to feel so strongly about sovereignty issues, but on issues broadly out of the region and that don't directly affect their interests, they tend to abstain. They vetoed this. The Syria.
They did. So my sort of theory thoughts on that is that you really have to understand pretty deeply that how the extent to which Libya has affected decision making of the Security Council on Syria. The Council in last year approved this sweeping resolution to which Russia and China abstained. That authorized the NATO intervention in Libya, and the Russians, and not only the Russians and the Chinese, but also the Indians, who are also currently on the Security Council, feel that NATO wildly overstepped their mandate in executing this resolution.
And that's not a wholly unreasonable belief.
It's not, and they point to very concrete things, such as the resolution very specifically imposes an arms embargo on Libya, yet that arms embargo was flagrantly flaunted when they were arming the Syrian rebels, and that NATO became effectively the air force of the Libyan rebels. And so, I don't think they're at all wrong in believing that NATO overstepped its mandate. However, if you ask NATO that, they'll point to that one part of the resolution that says all necessary means, which was an important caveat, which they interpreted as meaning they could do whatever they want to carry out this mission effectively. So, I mean, there are two, I think there are two pretty legitimate arguments to make, but the fact is that the Russians and Chinese in particular feel completely sidelined by what happened in Libya and are now saying we don't want this to happen again in Syria. You guys violated the mandate that we abstained to last time. We're not going to give you another license to do something similar again. And that feeling is palpable at the UN right now.
Really?
And again, it's not just the Russians and the Chinese. It's others on the council. Others even like India, who supported this last resolution. I've heard the Indian ambassador say, "You guys violated the arms embargo that we imposed. Like, this is ridiculous. And I heard a very so the former head of UN peacekeeping is this guy named Jean-Marie Guéhenno, who's he's at the Brookings Institution right now. He's a French scholar, and he made a pretty astute point, I think, that I think IR nerds will appreciate. He said that to a similar extent that Rwanda was a collateral damage of the failed Somalia intervention, Black Hawk Down incident and all, that Syria is the collateral diplomatic damage of Libya, albeit most people in NATO would consider Libya to be a very successful intervention.
I mean, I guess I've seen a lot of things, and I mean, obviously you're there, and you have a better sense of what people are saying. I mean, I have been, for my own part, reluctant to completely accept. I mean, Russia has these interests in Syria that are completely apart from Libya, right? And it has, and I can see how Libya would have made the Russians more intransigent on this point potentially, but I guess it's harder for me to appreciate that this sense of betrayal is what is really the motivator behind Russian behavior, and why. I mean, had Libya never happened, how much more aggressive would the Russians have been willing to be on Syria, right? If they're still fundamentally interested in maintaining the Assad regime.
Well, I think it speaks to your question about what's China's sort of deal in all this. Is this retrenchment from what happened in Libya? Mm-hmm. With Russia, I don't think it's all one or the other. There are these very hard prudential interests that you just described, but I think also this sort of look how NATO played us last time feeling is strong. And the one, and I guess what's really surprised me through all this, surprised me the most is, like you said, Russia and China tend to, they don't like these kind of violations of sovereignty. They don't like these kind of humanitarian interventions. Mm-hmm. But historically or recently, if the relevant regional organization asks for it, then China or Russia will at least abstain. So, for example, China was a strong trading partner with Sudan, and they really didn't want, the UN or anyone intervening in Sudan. And it was really the African Union's, call for an international force in Darfur that, permitted them to abstain. And now you had, and in Libya, you had the Arab League calling for intervention. And now again, and that I think strongly encouraged the abstentions from Russia and China. Mm-hmm. But now again, you have the Arab League out on a limb calling for intervention. And yet the Chinese and the Russians are not willing to sort of bend to their call, which is an historic anomaly.
Right. Well, can we pause right there? Because, I mean, this resolution on Syria is weaker than the resolution on Libya, right? I mean, you don't have anything like, you don't have that by any means language. You don't have the language about a no-fly zone or anything along those lines, right?
Yeah.
I mean, even if this had passed, how would it have changed the policy landscape? Like, what additional tools would have been available if this or something similar to this were to pass on Syria?
Well, I think there are two ways of answering that. First, the main thing that the failed resolution did was endorse specifically an Arab League plan for transition in Syria, and that plan called for Assad to step down, for his deputy to take over, and for his deputy to oversee the creation of some sort of unity government in preparation for elections down the road. So that was really, that was potentially very significant. I mean, it would ended something like 40 years of Assad's family rule, although his, crony would have still been the guy in power. So the resolution itself was a big deal, although, you have, even if the resolution passed, who is going to enforce it?
Right.
If Assad decided to ignore the resolution, then perhaps that's sort of the next step would have been the sort of the sanctions or the ICC referral or an arms embargo, and the step after that, if Libya is a guide, would have been some sort of call for intervention of some sort.
Mm-hmm. Right, but that's
So I think the Russians maybe saw their opportunity to nip this thing in the bud.
right.
So it would have changed the conversation, I think, significantly, because people would have been calling for Assad to step down. I think it called for within 15 days.
Right. Which he may well have ignored, but then would have potentially triggered these other things.
Yeah,
So
potentially.
This is a question that we got a couple weeks ago from one of our loyal Foreign Entanglements viewers, which was the extent to which, and you just talked about the mention of the referral to the ICC and so forth, the extent to which the ICC itself and the presence of the ICC has changed the equation for people like Bashar Assad. Sort of in terms of thinking productively about exile, of thinking about a life after dictatorship, about how that life is now just not as safe as it was at times in the past, and that there just aren't deals that can be made that can effectively exclude dictators, or it can effectively immunize dictators from future retribution from the ICC, from the international legal community. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, I don't. I have some thoughts on it, but I don't know enough about the subject specifically. Well, I guess I would just like your thoughts on it. What are your thoughts?
Sure. Well, let me figure out a good way to answer this. So, the current prosecutor of the ICC, a guy named Luis Moreno Ocampo, and the futures in Argentine, and the future incoming new prosecutor, a woman named Fatou Bensouda, who's from Benin, I believe, or Gabon. Somewhere around there. Sorry, Madam Prosecutor. But
if you're watching, we're sorry.
So they, So they talk about what they call the shadow of the court, the shadow of the ICC, and by that they mean the actual political effects that the advent of the ICC has had on the decision making of leaders around the world. And they have a laundry list of decisions, big and small, that they point to in which the ICC has affected how would-be dictators or even countries in transition that don't want to fall back into the bad old days have approached issues of justice and have trained their militaries even. So they'll argue that there is this sort of wide, what they call shadow of the court that hangs over these kinds of decisions. And there's, you also have to keep in mind that there are a couple of heads of state that are, behind bars right now. They're awaiting trial, the most recent of which was Laurent Gbagbo of the Ivory Coast.
Right.
And, he's been nabbed. But I take it your question is sort of like, does facing the potential of facing criminal prosecution make these leaders want to entrench themselves more?
Right.
Or makes them want to moderate their behavior.
Right. So, in essence, the question, would be about: is there then a different sort of legal looming overhang here that has unpleasant effects on the decision making of dictators? Right, where sort of exactly as you said, where they are unwilling to accept something like a baby doc deal or something like a any sort of deal that leads to a productive exile, or even not an exile, but at least leads to a more peaceful transition, because that would lead to immunity or something else, and the ICC makes that less possible.
Yeah. It does. It very much does make that less possible. They speak about what they like, closing the spheres of immunity, and another good example of this is Yemen's Saleh right now, who's, I take it, is under treatment in New York. I don't think it's sort of one or the other, and it's also important to keep in mind that the Rome Statute that created the ICC does have a provision in it that the Security Council can delay the prosecution can delay any situation or any sort of ongoing case at the court if they think it's contrary to the interests of peace. So there is that escape clause that's built into the Rome Statute.
Is that escape clause difficult to trigger? I mean, is it something where you would have to go through?
Requires you have to overcome a veto to trigger it. and that was a big debate actually in the creation of the store. Would that require a veto to overcome it, or would it require, or would it not? It hasn't been implemented yet. There was some talk of using that to encourage Sudanese leader Bashar al-Assad to do it, but I think Russia and France and the United States said that this was a non-starter. We want justice, not the potential. We don't want to sort of let this guy off the hook.
Right.
But listen, I don't think it's necessarily one or the other. I think there are cases when the ICC prosecutions have very demonstrably changed the equation on the ground. I think this most recent issue in Côte d'Ivoire is a really important precedent where the internationally unrecognized deposed leader who created havoc on his way out is now sitting in a jailhouse in The Hague awaiting trial, and the fact that he is in a jailhouse in The Hague awaiting trial and not somewhere in the Ivory Coast under house arrest means that he's farther away and from his bully pulpit has been reduced. He doesn't have the same ability to control militias on the ground that he might have if he was just under house arrest. So I think separating these people from their sort of geographic area of where they made a mess is an important thing.
Right. In that sense, it helps to ensure a stable resolution with people who sort of otherwise would want to sort of continue to futz with the situation.
And a long-term resolution. And the other important thing is that the ICC itself doesn't take these questions about sort of whether or not it'll be good for the whether or not it will make a dictator want to entrench themselves more. They don't take that into the equation. They're very much a legal outfit. They look at the facts, and they build a case based on those facts. They don't speculate as to whether or not pursuing this case will have some sort of negative consequence on the geopolitical, decision making of the leader that they're investigating. It's a very narrowly focused, legal institution.
Right, and I think that makes that is exactly what makes many people nervous about it. Right, people who are sort of more interested in the sort of asserting that these are political questions and the political shall remain dominant. Right, who sort of resist the encroachment of the legal into the political. To use Schmittian terms, I guess. Well,
I think it is.
Yeah. Well, I think it clearly is. Right. It just sort of depends on how we evaluate that creep, right? Whether that creep is a progressively good thing. But it clearly is a sort of a creep into the political prerogative of states to pursue their interests, however they define them. And that's part of the point, is eliminating the ability of states to do that. So staying on these terms, there have been, and I think Russians have been willing to make this, and I think you've seen, for example, this comparison made on RT, which is the Russian TV network in the United States, comparing the situations in Syria and in Bahrain, and essentially trying to line up and say, well, Syria is a Russian client, and so the Russians can be expected to protect their client. Similarly, Bahrain is an American client, and the Americans have been just as willing to protect Bahrain in sort of the midst of its repression. Now, obviously, there are differences, right? The extent of oppression in Bahrain is far less than the extent of oppression in Syria. The extent of proceedings that have been sort of moving through the UN with regards to Bahrain are, again, far less intrusive than they have been in Syria. But at the same time, I guess there still is a point, right? The United States has a political interest in the survival of the regime in Bahrain in the same way that the Russians have a political interest in the survival of the Syrian regime. Sort of from the UN perspective, or sort of what utility does a UN perspective bring, to this question of, patrons and clients and the protection that patrons can give clients?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me sort of unpack what you just said about Bahrain, which I largely agree with. I mean, so we're talking on February 14th, which is the 1-year anniversary.
Happy Valentine's Day.
The big Happy Valentine's Day to you. But the hashtag Feb14 was sort of like the Twitter rallying cry for activists in Bahrain when they tried to make that what they call the Pearl Roundabout into sort of the next Tahrir Square. And we're totally suppressed. I mean, to me, the one sort of big lesson of Bahrain seems to be that, it shows that with, just the right of suppression, that a autocracy, a monarchy can suppress one of these democratic movements without too much global outcry. Right, they didn't bomb people. There was enough harassment. Just the right number of people were killed. Just the right number of people were detained and beaten up. So you didn't have like a huge outcry in the international community. Right. Yet they were still able to effectively suppress this regime, right. this uprising.
Right. I mean, notably, the Syrians. If I can interrupt just a second here, the Syrians. I mean, even Assad has been cagier than Gaddafi was, right? In terms of, I mean, Gaddafi is sort of the classic.
He uses tanks, not airplanes, right?
Well, but
I think that really what Gaddafi undid Gaddafi strategically was using air power to bomb civilians. Right. I mean, that captures, I think, people's confidence.
Well, I mean, and I think sort of the rhetorical insistence about what he was going to do in Benghazi, right? That ended up being such an easy sort of rhetorical in for the community that look what's going to happen. He said he's going to do it. So But anyway, continue.
But you also made this. I think it's important not to diminish the scale of repression and violence in Bahrain. I don't. So there have been 6,000 people killed in Syria so far. What's the population of Syria? Like 35, something like that million. And you've had, I don't know the precise number of people killed in Bahrain, but it's probably around the 100 or so. Right. And the population, or maybe more. I
thought it was a little less, but actually I haven't seen the list.
Or it could be less, and I apologize if I'm getting it wrong, but the population is only like 400, 500,000. Mm-hmm. So the proportionally, the violence may be similar. It's just not as overt. Mm-hmm. Except when the Bahrain government invited the Saudi army to suppress the revolt, which happened, which was like 3 months last spring. Mm-hmm. But your point about I think this is Bahrain is a great shame, I think, on the USA right now, for basically enabling this and not doing enough to prevent this crackdown and not doing enough to lead a transition into some sort of long-term democratic movement.
So, I mean, to look a little bit to the future, and let's imagine two futures with regards to Syria, and we'll set aside Bahrain. In one of these futures, you either have the rebellion expands and you have civil war, but whatever it leads to, Assad falls either way. In this one particular future, through whatever means, maybe at some point the Russians, seeing the writing is on the wall, become more flexible. And in another future, Assad's repression is successful. The repression that we sort of think never is really going to work, but it has worked in the past. And so, a year from now, Assad is still the president of Syria. What implications does this have? Do either of these futures have for the future of the Security Council, but more generally, the future of right to protect or responsibility to protect and the ability of the international community through the UN to prevent leaders from carrying out really violent oppression versus their people?
Mm-hmm. I think, I guess to talk to your second question about sort of R2P, as they call the responsibility to protect, which maybe we should explain, is this concept that was formally adopted by the UN in 2005 that says that countries have the duty and the responsibility to protect their own citizens from atrocity and mass slaughter. And if they don't live up to that responsibility, then the international community has a responsibility to intervene. And intervention doesn't necessarily mean, sending in the bombers. It means they have to do something, and it gives a legal justification for the violation of a country's sovereignty. So that's the background, and that was successfully invoked for the first time in Libya. And no one will argue right now at the UN that this wasn't a success in terms of protecting civilians in immediate danger. It happened at just such remarkable speed. But it's also important to keep in mind that Syria is not the only example out there, or even the bloodiest example out there, where that R2P has not been evoked because the one or two members of the Security Council, or for any other political reasons, have not have blocked this. And the best and least talked about example of this is probably Sri Lanka. In May, or in spring of 2009, something like 25,000 people were killed in a very short period of time. Were backed into a small sliver of beach in Sri Lanka, and the government there they did defeat the Tamil Tigers once and for all, but they took several thousand civilians with them. And that was met with silence, and because there wasn't much interest on the Security Council and powerful and influential members to pursue it. So Syria is not the only example out there of these sort of double standards, but I think this is the real world. R2P isn't ideal. In the real world. There are certain political factors that come in, and I think probably what we're seeing now is that the degree to which a regime is isolated is the degree to which countries might be willing to invoke R2P. And so Libya by March of 2011 was completely isolated. You had a Human Rights Council resolution that was actually co-sponsored by Palestine and Israel. You had a General Assembly resolution that only, I think, Venezuela at that point opposed. And then you had the trickle up to the Security Council, which sort of acted on this international isolation. I think maybe I don't know if this is a tangent or if I'm rambling now, but one of the key sort of things to watch and factors, and one of the big reasons that China and Russia and the international community, or the international diplomatic community, to be very specific, was so captured with Libya was the defections among their diplomatic corps. We haven't seen that yet with Syria, and if we do, I mean that's what might set some momentum rolling. I mean, it was the Libyan ambassador, the Libyan deputy ambassador to the UN, pleading at the Security Council for intervention that helped convince China and Russia to move on. We haven't seen those sort of defections with Syria yet, and that might be, I think, what changes the calculus if it changes.
All right. Well, okay. I mean, I don't have anything else. I mean, this has been, I think, a very interesting comment. The interesting thing is about blogging heads right now is that I think there are probably 12 different dialogues that have some talk about Syria in them. And, I think by the end of all this, you're going to get to sort of a vast and very interesting body of work from a bunch of very interesting people on rights, responsibilities, and legal implications of U.S. or not U.S. but global relations with Syria right now. So that's I think that's sort of a very interesting development. But well, I don't have anything else to say. Do you have anything else you want to add before we go?
Happy Valentine's Day.
Happy Valentine's Day. It's going to be a late Valentine's Day.
Right.
Happy February 15th. How about that to everybody? Go out there and just be nice to people because it's not Valentine's Day. I mean, you can still buy people chocolate.
But you can be mean to me in the comments. I'm used to it.
Right, well, that'll work too, right? Or you could be really nice to us. I mean, you could send us chocolate and flowers. Nicer. We would accept chocolate and flowers. And I'll put the address in the comments. So, anyway, well, thanks, Mark, very much. And hopefully we'll have you on a little bit more often in the future.
All right. Thanks.